All right, guys, we're on 29a2. And Abai explained above that the dispute between the Tana Kamma, which is Rabbi Meir, and Rav Yehuda in our Mishnah concerns both damage at the time of the fall, in other words, whether stumbling is considered negligence or not, and damage after the fall, in other words, whether one who declares his hazardous object ownerless, and in that case, is it ownerless, is he liable for the subsequent damage? So the Gemara interprets Rav Yehuda's statement where he had intent, he is liable in the light of the second dispute. Before we go there, just wanted to address Gavin's question yesterday, and for 1 minute, Gav, I don't really want to delay on this because we're under time pressure now. Gavin asked a good question. What is the actual difference between at the time of the fall and after the fall practically? The reality is he's right that Rabbi Meir, if he would hold him liable for the different reasons at the time of the fall and after, and Rav Yehuda would hold the owner of the pitcher not liable, they practically are, whether it's at the time of the fall or after the time of the fall, both either liable according to the same opinion or both free from obligation. So Gavin wanted to know the nuance if that was the case, which I thought was a good point. I think the reality is that Rabbi Meir might hold somebody with a greater degree of responsibility. In other words, there's a difference between liability of a mild payment and liability of a heavy payment. Now, I'm not suggesting necessarily that Rabbi Meir put a heavy payment on the second argument as opposed to the first, but it's possible. It could have been that if you declared your object ownerless in the public domain, your hazard, your pit, and then just abandoned it and somebody got themselves wrecked in that pit, or your animal died as a result of falling in somebody's pit, he might slam that with a much heavier penalty than the accident of what happens when somebody slips in water when you were possibly negligent when you slipped and you fell. Does that make sense, Gavin?
Yeah.
It's possible that the penalty is not as high, but I'm just guessing. I don't know.
I just want to mention one word. They may take in, it sounds like there's a possibility they take in, what's it called? Extenuating circumstances. That's all I'm saying.
No, but Rabbi Meir doesn't, because Rabbi Meir turns around and says, if you fell, you weren't watching where you were going. So the point of it is the only extenuating circumstance that might be taken into account is his penalty might not be particularly heavy.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
He might give a penalty to say, listen, in future, watch where you're going, but not at the same level as abandoning your object where somebody gets mangled in the public domain. That's gross negligence, according to him. So there's a difference between slightly negligent and grossly. So, yeah. So then the major argument is stumbling considered negligence, or after the fall, is your ownerless object considered liability for a hazard you left in the public domain or not? So those are the two arguments. It's very, very straightforward. Right, now let's go according to the second argument, and it says as follows. Regarding the dispute about one who declares his hazards ownerless, what is the case where he had intent? In other words, what kind of intent can render him liable? So the Gemara answers, Rav Yosef said, Rebbe Yehuda means that the owner is liable where he has intent to acquire the shards. And so said Rav Ashi. Rav Yehuda means that the owner is liable where he had intent to acquire the shards. So what that means in a nutshell is very, very straightforward. This is also according to the Nimukei Yosef, that he never meant to declare the shards ownerless in the first place. And therefore, he is liable because that's not an ownerless object. So we say, don't play games here. If that container is worth something, then in that case, the person hasn't really declared it ownerless. But then let's use another example. Let's not use the word a pit and shards. Let's say that in the public domain, you left your cell phone and somebody slipped on it. Okay? Now, you want the contact list of your cell phone and the functionality. Then that would be a case of liability because you haven't really given up use of that object. But then that object is technically a discussion between Rav and Shmuel, where Shmuel said that you are liable for that object, whether it's ownerless or not. But he put it under the category of bor. And Rav said, listen, you're liable because it's sure, it's your object. And therefore, just like an ox that damages that you consider your property and you have to pay for utensils that are broken in that domain or the fact that it injures somebody, in this case too, you haven't given up ownership and you'd have to pay. Let's move on. The Gemara discusses the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages in the Brisa. Rav Elazar said, the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages concerned damage inflicted at the time of the fall. Now, just want to bring something to your attention. At this point in the Gemara, nobody's heard of Rav Elazar. He's coming into the play, into the opera at this point. So up until now, he hasn't played a part, but he is going to play a big part now. All we've had in discussion is Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Now it's going to discuss one of the Amor, which is Rav Elazar. Okay? So Rav Elazar said the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages concerns damage inflicted at the time of the fall. So the problem is, let me just mute Kevin. Okay. The problem is this seems to infer that if I say to you, Gavin, Arthur, that this argument concerns damage at the time of the fall, what does this imply? That I'm not concerning myself with the argument of what happens after the fall. That's the implication from the Gemara of Rav Elazar. So it's saying, if therefore that's the implication, what is their opinion concerning damage after the fall? Does Rav Elazar mean that in the opinion of all, that the owner is not liable? But that can't be, because there's Rabbi Meir who rules that the owner is liable in such a case, okay, after the fall. Rather, what does Rabbi Elazar mean? Does he mean that in the opinion of all, the owner is liable? But that too cannot be, because there are sages who rule that he is not liable. So what the Gemara is basically saying here, Arthur, is, I don't know if you read it, but when you first read it, it's a bit confusing. But when you read it, what it's saying is he's not focusing only on one side of the argument, because if he focused on either at the time of the fall or after the fall only, he would then implicitly be agreeing that there's no discussion in terms of the other part of the argument because the sages agree. And it's saying, well, that can't possibly agree. Because if he's discussing at the time of the fall, then he's implying there's nothing to discuss after the fall because they agree. Does that make sense, Gavin? And we can see that they don't agree. Why? Because it shows that Rabbi Meir and the sages don't agree. So it's saying that that can't be what is meant to come out of it. Right. So the Gemara explains Rav Elazar's statement. What does Rav Elazar mean when he says that the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages concerned damage at the time of the fall? He means that their dispute concerns even damage at the time of the fall. Okay, so what he's saying is not that it's excluding the other, but it's talking about even this sort of damage where you wouldn't have thought there was a discussion. Okay, because at the time of the fall, you wouldn't have thought there's a discussion either. But then the Gemara is going to have an issue with this. He means that the dispute concerns even damage at the time of the fall, and Rav Elazar thereby teaches us the same as what Abaya taught above, which is the Gemara cited another statement about the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages in the Brisa. But Rav Yochanan says the dispute between Rabbi Meir and the sages concerns damage inflicted after the fall. Okay, so two people have come on the scene now. Who's come on the scene? Rav Elazar. And who else has come on the scene now? Rav Yochanan. So who are Rav Elazar and Rav Yochanan? They are Amoraim. Okay? So they're coming on to have a debate. And Rav Yochanan is saying that, listen, the dispute here is primarily the damage after the fall. Rav Elazar said it's at the time of the fall. But just like we questioned Rav Elazar as saying, listen, what do you mean at the time of the fall? That's implying after the fall they don't have any dispute. And we can see that Rabbi Meir and the sages do have a dispute. By the way, Rav Yehuda goes according to the sages. It's just he was the, what you call it, the more open voice about it. So it's saying the same thing to Rav Yochanan. It's asking Rav Yochanan now, if you want to say it's about the dispute after the fall, you must be implying that there's no issue at the time of the fall. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
So fine. So it's saying, what is the opinion concerning damage at the time of the fall? If you're saying that the issue Rav Yochanan is after the fall, do not. So it's now quoting a statement from the Mishnah by Rav Yochanan himself. Do not say that the Mishnah is consistent only with Rabbi Meir, who says that the one who stumbles is considered negligent. He implies that Rabbi Meir would hold one liable for damage inflicted at the time of the fall. Rather, what must Rav Yochanan mean? He must mean that in the opinion of all, the owner is liable. But since Rav Yochanan said, do not say that the Mishnah is consistent only with Rabbi Meir, who says that the one who stumbles is negligent, he implies that the sages do not hold liable one who damages at the time of the fall. So what is this basically saying? So guys, it's saying as follows. It's questioning Rav Elazar and it's questioning Rav Yochanan. And it's saying to both, Rav Elazar said, listen, we're focusing at the time of the fall. And the Gemara is saying to him, hang on, are you saying there's no argument after the fall? Because we can see that Rav Meir and Rav Yehuda don't agree. So he's saying, no, I'm saying that even at the time of the fall, we're having a discussion. So therefore, that's where his headspace and emphasis is. He's not excluding the other. Then Rav Yochanan is saying, listen, it's focusing on after the time of the fall. And it's saying, but then at the time of the fall, you yourself said in the Mishnah that Rabbi Meir holds on liable and the sages don't agree. Therefore, you can see that there is something to discuss at the time of the fall. So why are you only focusing on what happens after the fall? Does that make sense, Gav?
Yeah.
So what's the point of this discussion backwards and forwards? It's basically saying that both Rav Elazar and Rav Yochanan agree that their arguments on both points of view, at the time of the fall and after, it's just their particular focus is on different aspects because they're both going to bring a issue that they have with it, and the issues are different. All right. Having shown that Rav Yochanan cannot mean that Rabbi Meir and the sages agree regarding damage at the time of the fall, even though he chose to obviously focus at after the fall, he's not implying that at the time of the fall there is an argument. So now the Gemara reinterprets Rav Yochanan's teaching. Okay, what does it teach? Rather, this is Rav Yochanan is teaching us the sages rule that one who declares his hazards ownerless is not liable only as a case in this one, where the damaging party is a victim of an unavoidable accident, namely stumbling, but in an ordinary case of one who declares his hazardous objects ownerless, the sages would rule that he's liable. Okay. Kevin, have you chapped what I've said, or do you want me to repeat this last statement?
Just go do a 1 minute review. Sorry, that call I had, and okay. Yeah, just go, yeah.
Okay, so what Rav Yochanan is coming here is saying, listen, he wants to focus on a particular issue of the Gemara. He wants to focus on this issue of what happens at the time of the fall with regards to liability. Up until now, we've only had we've had two interpretations. One of Rav Meir that said, listen, if you stumble, that's an avoidable accident. You should look where you're going. And Rabbi Yehuda that says, you're not liable. It was an accident. And then we see them have a different argument with regards to your hazard you created in the public domain. Rabbi Yehuda said it's ownerless. Therefore, if you make it ownerless, you're not liable. And Rabbi Meir said you are liable because you've created a hazard in the public domain. So what Rav Yochanan is saying is these two issues are actually linked. How are they linked? Because he's interpreting Rabbi Yehuda differently. How is he interpreting Rabbi Yehuda? He's interpreting Rabbi Yehuda as saying, listen, even Rabbi Yehuda would say you are liable in such a case if you create a hazard in the public domain and you declare it ownerless. It's only a case when the hazard occurred as a result of a unavoidable accident, in that case, you wouldn't be liable if you declared it ownerless. Mate constraint says that Rav Yochanan brings a different interpretation on Rabbi Yehuda. We thought up to now that Rabbi Yehuda says, if you declare your hazard ownerless, you're not liable in the public domain. Rav Yochanan is saying, the Rav Yehuda and the sages, which are on the same page, Rabbi Meir, remember, is more stringent in his generation than everybody else. But they're saying Rav Yehuda and the sages are saying that it's only where it was an unavoidable accident that hazard was occurred, that in that circumstance you can declare it ownerless and not be liable. But in any other case, if you declare it ownerless, you are still liable. So this is a slightly different interpretation on Rav Yehuda.
So then, what's the difference between ownerless and retaining the pit?
No, so Gavin, we're talking about here a case where we're not talking about a pit for a second. We're talking about a pitcher. The reason why we're talking about a pitcher is unless you're mad in the head, no one would say, this is my pit. I'm proud of my pit. Look what hazard I made in the public domain. Whereas your pitcher, as you said yesterday, which was quite right, that sometimes a pitcher can hold a function of a container that you like very much. And that we've all kept containers. I've kept Tupperwares and all sorts of things where I've bought another article within that container. And the container itself has provided use. So therefore, in that case, that is a tolda of a pit. And therefore, I see some affection in it, and I don't want to declare it ownerless. Does that make sense? Like a stone, a knife, and a burden left in the public domain. So in that particular case, it's a little different to a pit in that you'd want to keep ownership of it, exactly according to what Rafi Ashi said earlier on. We're talking about a case here of because you stumbled and fell, you have a leniency that if you declared that hazardous, ownerless, in that case you wouldn't be responsible, but in every other case, guys, you would be responsible, according to Rav Yehuda and the sages, for that ownerless object in the public domain because it's created a hazard. Okay? Rav is different, but let's just concentrate on Rav Yehuda and the sages. So this is the interpretation from Rav Yochanan. It's very straightforward. Does everybody understand that?
Yeah.
Can I go on?
I do.
Okay, it's pretty straightforward. So in other words, the sages rule that one who declares his hazards ownerless is not liable only in a case such as this one where the damaging party is the victim of an unavoidable accident. In other words, here stumbling. But in an ordinary case of one who declares his hazards ownerless, the sages would rule that he is liable. Okay. So, if we go on, the Gemara responds that this is not necessarily so. Why? So what we're saying is there's a Amorite dispute on the matter. Why? It was stated regarding one who declares his hazard ownerless is a dispute between Rav Yochanan and Rav Elazar. One says he is liable and the one says he is not liable. So at the moment we don't know who holds what. The only thing we know is that Rav Yochanan's comment on Rabbi Yehuda, to add a bit of depth to Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in this circumstance of hazard being ownerless and non-responsibility in the case of stumbling. But what we're saying is we don't know what they view, because this is the Amorite dispute. There's a dispute between Rav Yochanan and Rav Eliezer. One says he is liable and one says he's not liable. So what we're going to find out in this ensuing Gemara is who holds by what opinion. That's what we're going to try and find out. And we're saying, shall we say that the one who rules that he is liable agrees with Rabbi Meir, and the one who rules that he is not liable agrees with the sages? So now we're not concerned whether it's Rav Elazar or Rav Yochanan has what opinion. And for now we're saying that whoever has the opinion, whoever the Amorite opinion is that he is liable, can we say that he actually agrees with Rabbi Meir? And can we say whoever says he is not liable agrees with Rav Yochanan? Can you see, Gav?
Yeah.
It's not saying who do they agree. It's not saying at this point who's of what opinion. It's saying, can you say automatically that somebody says that you are liable, he agrees with Rabbi Meir, and automatically somebody that says you're not liable agrees with the sages or Rav Yehuda? So the Gemara responds that this isn't necessarily so. Okay? Because as far as we're concerned, and as far as Rabbi Meir is concerned, everyone agrees that the owner is liable. Where do they disagree? They disagree concerning the view of the sages. The one who rules that the owner is not liable agrees with the sages without qualification. So what does it mean without qualification? Okay. So let's just get this a little bit clear. Is that why would Rabbi? I want to ask you guys a question. Well, I can put it to you as a statement, which will save a bit of time. The reason why Rabbi Meir would hold one liable for placing a hazardous object in the street deliberately is obvious. Why is it obvious? Because if Rabbi Meir would hold that person liable even through an accidental fall, it's obvious that when one created a pit on purpose, then Rabbi Meir would hold them liable. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Off? Off?
Arthur's on mute.
Yeah, I'm on mute.
Okay, but all I'm saying is that in a case where it's an accidental fall, if he's that strict, if somebody actually created a pit in the public domain, there's no question he'd hold them liable. That's
Yeah, even more so.
Yeah. Now, what is this term about qualification? In other words, if you hold, as far as the view of Rabbi Meir is concerned, everyone agrees that the owner is liable. Okay, if you hold by his view. Where do they disagree? They disagree concerning the view of the sages. The one who rules that the owner is not liable agrees with the sages without qualification. So what is this term without qualification?
So the qualification is whether it was intentional or unintentional. So if they eliminate that, then you always then you're never liable, regardless whether it was intentional or not. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay, let's see how it plays out. So according to whoever the Amorai is that agrees with the sages, a person is not responsible for any ownerless hazard, even one that he created deliberately. Let me give you this thought here. So unqualified means as follows, is that when the Torah imposes responsibility for a pit that's in the path of the public domain, it actually refers to a pit that is privately owned. In other words, Gavin, someone dug a pit on his premises, and then he declared the premises, but not the pit, ownerless. So therefore, the Torah doesn't hold one responsible for a pit he digs in the public domain because he doesn't own it. So what it's saying is the Torah example of qualification means that the classic case is that a pit is owned. Does that make sense? And therefore, within the definition of a pit created in the public domain, that is not the Torah definition. There are some of the sages that hold according to that. Have I lost you? Just tell me if I've lost you.
Yeah, just repeat that last comment.
Yeah.
All right. We discussed that there's an issue that Rav has and Shmuel has. So there are two different opinions of how the laws of pit are derived in the Torah. The one has the case of where you owned your premises, okay, and that you built a swimming pool, and that you couldn't make the mortgage payment, for example, and then you had to give up your property to the public domain because you no longer could make the payments. So the only thing you could afford to keep was the swimming pool. And it's a nice hot summer day in Israel, so I'll give up the pool. Fine. So then if it's an owned pool, then if anybody drowns in it, you're responsible, right? So that's the classic case of where we get this concept of an owned hazard where you're responsible for it. And therefore, any hazard that you create in the public domain, like a pit, that's ownerless. Now, why would you say it's ownerless? It's ownerless, Gavin, for the following reason, is that whoever digs a pit is not particularly affectionate about that they've created something beautiful in the public domain. You're not insane. You know, he might have created a pit. I don't know if I was insane. I don't know why he created a pit. Maybe he was just trying to dig his car out of a ditch. Let's say that. But it's not that the pit he's marveling at his creation. So therefore, he doesn't hold any emotional attachment to the pit, and it's ownerless in that case. Since it's ownerless, and the Torah doesn't speak about that as the classic example in this definition of the sages' view of derisa, of what a pit is, the sages say that they wouldn't hold him responsible for an ownerless pit in the public domain. So that's what we term without qualification, because he doesn't own it. So it's the same that applies for an object that one leaves in the public domain, whose law is derived from the pit. In other words, if he owns the object, okay, then he is liable for any damage it might inflict. But if he declared it ownerless, then even if he had put it in the public domain deliberately, like in the case of digging a pit, he's not responsible for it. Okay, so that's without qualification. I'm going to explain what qualification means. And the one who rules that he's liable will say to you that I would say is true even according to the sages. So thus far the sages ruled that one who declares his hazards ownerless is not liable only in the case such as this one where he stumbled because he's a victim of an unavoidable mishap, but in an ordinary case of one who declares his hazards ownerless, the sages would agree he is liable. So Kevin, then he's saying there's a separate group of sages, and those separate group of sages say that a person is liable. Why? Because if you create a hazard in the public domain like a pit, it is negligence, meaning you don't suddenly start to dig a pit and you're unaware of what you're doing. Because there is a cognizance of what you're doing, it means you've done it on purpose. It's not an unavoidable accident. And therefore, to create a hazard in the public domain is a form of negligence. Or if you threw your article out of a car and you left it there on purpose, then even if you declared it ownerless, why? Because you threw it out your window like that idiot that threw a Coke bottle out the window of Louis Boerta Avenue, that clearly declared it ownerless. But if it damaged the car, then he is liable because you created a hazard in the public domain. And therefore, what does it mean with qualification? It means that there are certain rabbonim that say that the Torah holds one accountable for a pit he dug in the public domain, because although he doesn't own the pit, he is responsible for it because he created it. So this law is derived that one is responsible for an object he left in the public domain, even if he does not own it, okay? However, the sages say he's not liable in this case because he never put it in the ground deliberately or created a pit deliberately. He fell, he stumbled. And therefore, only in this case, because the hazard occurred through no fault of his own, he's not responsible for it. Because it can't be classified as the Torah's version of the bore, because it wasn't created deliberately. Since he doesn't own it, and it can't be classified as the shore either, because he's not responsible for it, nor does he claim ownership for it. Does that make sense, Gavin? It's fairly straightforward. So the sages have two separate opinions. The ones that say he's not liable at all, they both say, listen, both the sages say he's not liable at all. Why? Including Rav Yehuda. Because one views that he's declared the pit ownerless, and it only talks about like the swimming pool case where that pit was something he owned because he gave up his property and he retained the swimming pool. I'm just using that as an example. Then there's another version of the Torah interpretation which says he created a hazard in the public domain, and even if he didn't own it, he did it with deliberately. In other words, with intent by digging the pit, and therefore he's responsible. So he would ordinarily be liable, but this case he stumbled and fell. And since Rav Yehuda and the sages say stumbling is an unavoidable accident, he's not liable only in this case. That's all. That's all it's saying. Nothing complicated.
Got it.
Okay, I try to make it easy for you guys. I hope I've helped.
Yeah, tremendously. Thank you.
All right. Right, now, Rabbi Mayerful, can you teach us?
Yeah. Okay, so this I want to do for Refu'ah for my friend who's having tests in Jerusalem. His name is Tzvi Stern, very good guy from, let me just find his name here. Person I met and his family in Ramat Beit Shemesh, and he's having as they're having some tests, and please God, he'll be okay. So his name is Tzvi Chaim ben Sarah Tziporah.
Amen.
And please God has us in Refu'ah. And okay, so what I'd like to say is, okay, let's continue where we left off about the crouched animal, about your enemy. It's a negative commandment not to fail to keep a vow. Okay, very important. I know it says here, he shall not break his word. And this comes from Bava Kamma daf. If you promise something, you got to keep your word. As we said the other day, there was a similar halacha which you say bali neder, or you say you don't say I'll definitely do something for you. I'll try my best. Or you say bali neder, which covers yourself. Okay, and continue on this theme. And it's a negative commandment not to delay one's vowed or voluntary offering. When you make a vow, you shall not be slack to pay it. And this comes from Devarim. One does not transgress this until the 3 pilgrimage festivals pass by for him. Now, charity is also in the category of vowed offerings. But over charity, if a person delays, he violates at once the injunction, you shall not be slack to pay it, since poor people are around and about. If there are no needy persons there, let him set the money aside and leave it until he finds a poor person. If he stipulated, though, that he would not give it until he found an indigent man, he does not need to set it aside. Okay, so, you get people, and I'm not judging anyone, or I don't know anyone specifically. They make, like a Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, they come up and they get an aliyah and they pledge tzedakah, and they don't pay for months. Or this, even to let's say a radiothon or charity drive, they pledge and they don't pay. And this is what this is referring to. The people are depending on this money, even if it's a shul, for their funds. People need this money urgently, and you can't just say it because it's good and you look good. You've got to keep your word. Rather don't then if it's just you're going to look at put in someone else's eyes. Then that's it's not about that. Do the right thing.
Kev, what was interesting is that I was chatting to somebody that is involved with collections on Simchat Torah in South Africa. I don't know if you remember, but they collect their money for the year from most people that after a couple of drinks, and it's a difficult thing. They keep outbidding each other. They take a bid. I've never approved of this. At the shul where people bet Levi and they bet the Torah portion, and the shul does it to raise money. So you've got a lot of ego-driven people that want to outbid one's fella, which in itself I have a big problem with. I know the shul needs money, but if everybody has a good level of conscientiousness, they'll give the most they can give to tzedakah based on their awe and fear and reverence of the Torah and Hashem. And they shouldn't have to have their ego stroked in order to outbid the other. The biggest problem that the shuls have, funny enough, is collecting on that money. Yeah. Everybody says, no, well, the shul collected millions, or they collected hundreds of thousands because everybody promised. You know how few people actually fulfill that obligation on a monthly debit order? I hear this news from people that are involved in these shuls. Yeah. The whole process to me is terrible. Terrible.
I tell you what, I've experienced it at 2 shuls specifically.
Don't mention the shuls.
Yeah, I won't. And I'll tell you something, it's uncomfortable for the poorer people because you sit there, you haven't given a cent, or you've given $100, $200 or something, or $500. It's minimal. 1,000, I think I've given before for one of those bid things. That's the best I can do. But there are guys who have given 100,000, 50,000, 80,000, and you feel like an absolute schmuck there.
Gavin, you are right. You know what it's doing? It's sending a message. You know what it's sending a message? It's a terrible message, Kevin. It tells you that, listen, it's all very nice that we tell you in the shul that it matters where your heart is and the mitzvahs you do, but what really counts is how much money you have. And you don't count if you don't have the money. And that's the message it's sending.
And they do the same thing when it comes to aliyahs. This happens at all shuls, most shuls as well, is that they call the same people, the guys that obviously give the bigger donations to the shul and things like. I'm a Kohen, the only time I really get caught up at most shuls is doing mincha on Shabbos. But to get caught up doing the main, on Shabbos morning, sure, very difficult. Even being a Kohen, very rare that I get caught up.
Yeah, Kevin, it's a good point. May your friend make a full refu'ah. May he be blessed.